Hi, this is Professor Kahan Lust, and this is History 1301, United States History to 1877. We are on Lecture 11, The Second Great Awakening. Before we get to our Exam 2, we have to deal with some changes that are going on in American religion in the turn from the 18th to the 19th century. And one of the big changes right off the bat is the implementation of revivalism and a new religious creation, as well as their effect on American society and reform. In our last lecture, we talked about 1819 setting the tone for political discourse, and it sets the tone for political discourse for the next 40 years, from 1819 right up until the Civil War. However, the religious changes we're going to be talking about here are going to set the tone for reform in the United States for the next 100 years. So this is a hugely important movement that comes about in the turn to the 19th century. There's a new kind of religious thought that's bursting onto the scene at this point, and it's frequently referred to as the Second Great Awakening. Before there were revivalists or televangelists, there was a man named Charles Grandison Finney, and he sort of spurs this movement toward the Second Great Awakening. And when he's all said and done, when he's done with all of this stuff, American church membership is going to explode. By the time the Civil War rolls around, 75% of Americans are going to be identifying themselves as church members. Now, Charles Grandison Finney was a lawyer, and in the fall of 1821, he was involved in a case that, by his own journals and writings, had quote unquote biblical precedence. So, according to his autobiography, for the first time in his life, Finney decided he was going to have to read the Bible. He needed to read the Bible in order to understand this case. And by his own wording, Finney became obsessed with the Bible, consistently and constantly reading it. One morning, while reading his Bible, Finney said that he got what he described as a holy vision to go out and pray. And so he rushed out into the woods to pray, but he found when he got there that he couldn't. He said he, quote, didn't know how. So he then says he was directed by a spirit that guided him out there, and the spirit guided him into how to fix this. And the spirit told Finney that he had to go through a transformative experience. Essentially, it's what modern evangelists would say is being born again. That's the transformation that he's talking about. And Finney does this. He follows the Spirit's directions and he goes through all of this. And then he devotes the rest of his life, not to his legal practice, but to getting others to go through this same experience. Finney had a very specific message for his followers. He was calling on people to change their ways, much like the preachers of the First Great Awakening were calling on people to change their ways. But he also had another part of this message. If enough people converted to Christianity, then it would hasten the second coming of Christ. Now, this idea that if you convert people and the more people that convert, the quicker the second coming will happen, this idea is called millenarianism. And you can see it's spelled on the screen here. So I'm not going to spell it out for you. But millenarianism is this type of idea that Finney is promoting through his conversions. And this is a massive movement, but it had its precursors in the revival movements that were beginning across the middle parts of the country, starting as early as 1801 in a place called Cane Ridge, Kentucky. Kentucky's largest city in 1800 had just under 1,800 people. However, Cane Ridge, they had this massive tent revival and immediately attracted 25,000 people to it. So it inflated the entire state of Kentucky on some level. There were dozens of ministers. They were coming from all sorts of different denominations from across the country. It was unprecedented. Nothing like it had ever been seen in the United States before. And at this revival meeting, according to people who kept diaries about it, people were, quote, howling, shrieking, screaming, and speaking in tongues. And the modern revival has its roots, has its origins in these tent revivals in Cane Ridge. And this is done over and over and over again in the United States. Now, it's got a parallel, it's parallel in some ways to the First Great Awakening in that this revivalism spreads across the country. It's obviously different in from the standpoint that the First Great Awakening starts in colonies in New England and then spreads southward. This time we're talking about it starting, if you will, in the middle of the United States and spreading northward and southward out from the middle of the country. Hundreds of these tent revival meetings sweep the country, and it becomes, like the First Great Awakening did, it becomes the most widely shared American experience in the 19th century until we get to the American Civil War. So, very much like the First Great Awakening, it creates this sort of shared identity. Now, to give you an idea of how many tent revival meetings were happening, people could actually track the tent revivals by following the path of where the tents had actually been. When tents were put down over these massive areas, they would, quote, burn the grass out because the grass isn't getting sunlight, so the grass is turning a sort of brownish color. So you could actually track these brown patches of grass that people actually started calling the burned over district. So people could track this stuff very easily. Now, this is a stark change for the United States. In the census of 1800, only 5% of Americans actually identified themselves as church members. But by 1860, when the Civil War begins, in 1860, we're on the verge of it. I'm sorry. It begins in 1861. But when the United States is on the verge of civil war, 75% of Americans identify as church members. So something is happening here. Now, sociologists argue that as people become more modern, as they become more advanced, they become more secularly or non-church oriented. However, what we see in the United States is the opposite, an exception, if you will. The United States is becoming more industrialized, we're becoming more advanced, and we're also becoming more religious at the same time. So how could that be, aside from just going, well, we're Americans, we're different, and that's the way it goes? How it happens, how is that this is a different type of religion. It's something very different that's going on in the United States at this moment as opposed to the rest of the world. While we've got all of this industrialization going on, we also are seeing from a social standpoint a reaction to disestablishment. If you remember in a previous class, I talked about disestablishment, meaning that the states were abolishing this idea of having, quote, established churches. Taxpayer money was no longer being used to actually spend, to pay for preachers' salaries, to pay for building construction, to pay for rectories, all that sort of stuff. Now, this is a problem because those preachers still want to be paid. The people who come to church, the congregants, want a building to actually worship in. So they need money. So how do they get these dollars? Very simple. You stage revivals so that you can bring in tens of thousands of people. So in part, it's a reaction to the loss of the money that the states had been giving the churches. But I think a more important change, rather than just disestablishment, is that these ministers also have a different set of values. Now, in theory, these ministers should have been just like the Puritan ministers. They are trained in exactly the same way. They have gone to the same divinity schools. The curriculum they're undertaking is exactly the same. They are being taught and guided by the theories of a former Methodist minister named John Calvin. So these people are being trained in the same way. And what John Calvin argued was that God and God alone determines salvation. Now, you've heard this before. The Puritans talked about God and God alone determines salvation. So this is how these preachers are being schooled. But when they go out, when they have their own ministries out there, in practice, they're saying, no, everyone has the ability, every individual has the ability to choose between heaven and hell. And this idea of choosing between heaven and hell is a very distinctly American notion. Now, obviously, this spreads throughout, but at the moment, it's a very distinctly American notion. The message of these ministers was the choice of heaven or the choice of sin. And these guys said that it's not just the individuals who do this, society as a whole makes this choice. Like the Puritans, these ministers saw Americans as the chosen people. So it's really not hard to see why millenarianism appealed. It's not hard to see why this religious sentiment spreads throughout the United States, that we are a society, we're all in it together, and that we're chosen. These ideas still have a huge amount of influence today. And this whole idea of the transformation from this older type of religion that we read about in Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God and the like, this is yet another example about how the world of the Founding Fathers was going by the wayside. The Founding Fathers, no matter what anyone else tells you to the contrary, were not particularly religious people. This does not mean that they were not Christians. It doesn't mean that a number of them were not quote unquote believers. Many of them identified as Christians. Many of them went to church. But it's important to understand their motivations and what their philosophies about God actually were. For example, George Washington was a churchgoer and was even a deacon in the Anglican Church, which makes a lot of Americans go, see, obviously he was very strongly Christian and a founding father. Therefore, founding fathers were Christians. George Washington, however, and Thomas Jefferson, for that matter, were both deacons in the Anglican Church because Virginia law required that if you were going to hold political office, you must be at least a deacon in the church. So they were doing this in large part out of expediency. In fact, the minister at George Washington's home parish in Mount Vernon frequently wrote letters to George complaining that George leaves services early and it's not particularly moral for him to be doing this. He's setting a bad example for the women in the church, since his wife, Martha, was considered to be one of the women's leaders in the church. In 1821, a minister of this Second Great Awakening era talked about George Washington and the other founding fathers, and he basically said that these men were non-believers, that they did not adhere to the Word of God, and that they were all in real trouble, and we needed to do something more than just follow the founding fathers. Now, on top of all of this, the founding fathers, for the most part, those who were believers, were what we would today refer to as deists, meaning that they believe that there's a higher power. If you want to call it God, you can call it God, but there's a higher power, a creative force that created everything in the world, but then stepped back, said, I've done my job, I've created it, I'm leaving this creation to mankind. And God, as these people saw it, did not interfere with the day-to-day lives of man and did not interact with man. Now, that's coming out of a period that we talked about in a previous class called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment changes almost everything about American society, and deism is one of these things. When you look through the Constitution of the United States, you're not going to find the word God, quote unquote, in the Constitution. Anywhere you'll see nothing about how we do this because we believe in God. Even if you look at the Declaration of Independence, there's a nod toward God. Jefferson says we're all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. There's no such statement in the Constitution. Why? When Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and the guys who literally wrote the Constitution were asked, their answer for it, Alexander Hamilton's literal answer was, "We forgot." Now, James Madison was a little bit more flowery in that, but he also essentially said, "Yeah, it just didn't even occur to us to put God into the Constitution." But if we want to kind of nail this down about how the founding fathers were not terribly religious people, let's look at at a major treaty that the United States concluded in these early years, in this early national period, in 1797 to be precise. It's a treaty that ended a war between the United States and various pirates in the region of North Africa, or what would today be Libya. This treaty was called the Treaty of Tripoli. And in Article 11, there's a very interesting statement. It's written, the treaty itself was written by an envoy of John Adams named Joel Barlow, who just happened to be a big friend of Thomas Jefferson. So Barlow goes and he writes this treaty. And it reads the following. It reads as follows, quote, "As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Mussulmen," they're referring to Muslims in this particular circumstance, "and as the said states never entered into any war or act of hostility against any Mohammedan nation, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries." Now, why I mention this treaty, why I bring this treaty up. Barlow himself is someone that you guys have probably never heard of. But Thomas Jefferson suggested Barlow for this mission to Tripoli to deal with these coastal pirates and with the Ottoman Empire that ruled the area. Jefferson suggests him. Adams appoints him. Adams approves of him. John Adams approves of him and sends him. This treaty comes back, and when it's submitted to the Senate, which is full of guys who were involved in the Constitutional Conventions, the Constitutional Convention, the Continental Congresses that created the United States, when it's full of these guys, the Senate adopted this treaty unanimously. So these guys were not people who were thinking with religion in the forefront of their mind. But before anybody loses their mind, anybody who believes in the idea of the Christian nation and our founding on these Christian principles, before you kind of lose it and tune me out here, understand that we're talking about the founding fathers' generation. Within one more generation, it's the next generation, it's this second generation of leaders that I'm talking about. They're very heavily involved in this revivalism. It's this new revivalism that transforms the United States of America from one of the least religious nations in the world to one of the most religious nations in the world. And again, we're still influenced by the sense that we as a people have moral standards and obligations, and if we don't live up to them, we will suffer calamity. So these ideas are still with us, very much like when we talked about the Puritans. I said these ideas carry forward into today. We're doing the same thing with these ideas too. So that idea about moral standards is there because we have these sensibilities about what we as a proper nation ought to do. Americans also still believe and still have a missionary-like zeal to remake the world in our own image. And when we go over to these countries and we do things like the modern word is engage in regime change or nation building, when we do that sort of stuff, we don't talk about religion. We talk about them from the standpoint of making them more like America. But the missionary zeal, the missionary-like zeal that I talked about, comes from this era, this transformative moment where we have all of these people engaging in all of this revivalism and millenarianist behavior. And the ideas behind this new revivalism are at once radical and conservative at the same time. They're radical, okay? They're radical because they said flat out, you and you alone determine your fate. Now think about how different that is from where we started this semester from a religious standpoint in the Americas. The Puritans were talking about predestination. God and God alone determines your fate. It's predestined. There's nothing you can do about it. Okay? It's God's decided, it's over with. Then we get to that first great awakening and the sinners in the hands of an angry God and all of that sort of stuff. And what Jonathan Edwards tells these people is that God has condemned you to hell and you inch closer and closer to hell. But if you accept God, if you do certain things that God wants you to do, you can change God's mind. But still, with Edwards' philosophy, he's saying it's still God that makes the decision. You can alter his decision, but it's still God making the decision. What's different here is that these people are saying, no, I make the decision. God is still the conduit. God, if I accept God and his laws and his ideas and all of that stuff, I'm going to heaven. But I make the decision, not God. This is radical. And again, for the moment, it's a very uniquely American idea. Okay, so it's radical from that standpoint. And it's conservative because during times of great change, things like economic upswings or economic downturns, says that we're all in this together and that we will all suffer or benefit from everything. So, what effect does this have on day-to-day life in the United States? Well, think about, again, taking the Puritans into account here. The Puritans had been obsessed with sin. They saw sin all around them. They said, this is sinful, this is sinful, this is sinful. But for most of the Puritans, sin was an abstract idea. It was a construct. It was not something that was observable. It was saying, this is sinful, but we don't see it all over the place. For these revivalists, sin is concrete. It is no longer an abstract concept. You can see it everywhere. It's tangible. Drinking, for example, drinking alcohol is considered to be sinful. Dueling, for a lot of Americans, dueling at the moment, at this particular historical moment, dueling is considered, quote, the great American sin. Now, for the most radical of these people like Charles Grandison Finney and others, as we're going to see, for them, slavery is sinful. Now, today, we associate this type of religious sentiment with political conservatism. But make no mistake, these religious revivalists in this moment saw themselves as radicals and as reformers. And indeed, they are behind every significant reform movement for the next 100 years in the United States. Now, these revivals tended on some level to be socially selective. If we look at who's doing this in the North and the South, it's two totally different groups of people. In the South, revivalism was aimed directly, was trying to attract the dispossessed in society, the poor, the enslaved. They are very much the target of revivalism because this revivalism is on some level a religion of dispossession in the South. And what I mean by this is accept your position in life. Don't rise up and try to overthrow this. So it reaffirms the social order that the planters are at the top and there's a ladder that goes further and further down the line for each person in society. But it's telling these dispossessed, do not do something about it in this life. Your reward is in the next life. Enslaved people, accept your status. Don't try to fight for freedom because someday you're going to enter the kingdom of God. People who are poor, don't try to overthrow the wealthy. Don't reach further than your grasp would allow because they'll use parables in the South to great length. They'll use parables like the idea that it's, quote, easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God, as a way of telling people, be satisfied with where you are, don't fight the social structure. Now, in the North, it reinforced an emerging upwardly mobile society. It encouraged people to seek upward mobility, because they themselves in the North, who were engaging in this upward mobility and in this new economy, they saw themselves as God's chosen people, and it was their duty to bring this message of success and financial success, financial success and godliness being linked. It's their mission to bring that to the impoverished. So their job is to go to the poor and say, look, the reason you're poor is not because you have been dispossessed and you need to wait for your reward in heaven. The reason you're poor is because you are not turning to God enough. If you turn to God, you'll find the answers. You'll become successful, quote unquote, like me. Okay. So in the North, it appeals to this emerging urban middle class, especially to women. They're a big part of the social selection in the North. Now, as a result of this, American society winds up being divided essentially into those who are converted and those who are not. Now, don't think of this like the Puritans, like the social dichotomy is the elect and the damned. It's not like that, okay? But people are concerned about, is a person going to heaven or are they going to hell? And where we can see this most easily is in the Panic of 1857, the worst depression the United States had up to this point. This is a moment where Americans are looking at everyone around them and saying, it's because we're sinful and we need to clean up our act, or more likely, it's because we are not sinful, but we're associating with people who are. Now, during this panic of 1857, cotton prices declined, land values declined, and people in the South were seeing wealth disappear literally overnight. They were wealthy one day, they're impoverished the next. And this convinced a lot of these people in the South that there was a distinct need to turn to higher things in life, to turn to God, for example. And revivalism kind of sparked again in this country. And since it's happening in the middle of this economic depression, it convinced both Northerners and Southerners that they alone were the moral force in this country. For example, Northerners are convinced that by adopting free labor and allowing each person to seek what is best for themselves from an economic standpoint, and not relying on slave labor, not commodifying human beings, we are the moral force in the world. The reason the economy is collapsing, Northerners argued, is because we are associating with those sinful Southerners who own slaves and treat people like things. And in the South, they're convinced of the same thing, except it's a different side of that coin. The South looks at itself and says, we are the moral force. We do not commodify the labor, which basically says that a person is only useful as long as they're productive. Yes, we own slaves, and we get that you think it's sinful, but we take care of the slaves. We take care of them from the moment they're born to the time that they die. And that makes us the moral people. And the reason cotton prices are declining, the reason land values are declining, the reason we're losing all of our wealth is because we've associated with those sinful people in the North who treat laborers as a thing that is only valuable so long as it's productive. So what I'm telling you is just like the First Great Awakening set the psychic preconditions for the Revolutionary War, the Second Great Awakening, especially seen in this Panic of 1857, set the psychic preconditions for the Second American Revolution, if you will, the American Civil War. Both the North and the South are traveling along two different paths, courtesy of this revivalism. And oddly enough, it's going to take an American who claimed no church affiliation, claimed no religious affiliation, even said that he never attended church. Abraham Lincoln is going to take all of this language of revivalism and turn it into political rhetoric and use it to gin up support for his presidency and for fighting the American Civil War. So, this religious revivalism is critically important to understanding how the United States actually gets to an American Civil War.